The auctioneer read the parcel description once, then read it again. 120 acres. Mostly cedar. Fenced down in 3 places, no certified water source on record. It was a Tuesday morning in March of 1987 in Dade County, Missouri, and the room had the kind of quiet that only happens at farm auctions after people have seen too many families lose ground. The opening bid was $18,600. Nobody moved. The auctioneer waited, looked over the room, and dropped it to $15,000. Still nobody moved. Then a man near the window said, not loudly, but loud enough for the room to agree with him, "You're buying brush, not pasture." That was when Cal Morgan raised his hand. The auctioneer looked at him and said, "You understand there's no well listed on that place?" Cal said, "I understand what's listed." The gavel came down. $15,000. $125 an acre. That was the line people repeated at the coffee counter for the next 6 months. What Cal had seen was not on the listing. If stories about forgotten farms, old wells, and the quiet wisdom of rural land mean something to you, subscribe to Old Farm Wells and tell us where you're watching from. Cal Morgan was 41 years old. He had 44 commercial Angus pairs on leased ground outside Greenfield, ground he had worked for 11 years without owning a single acre of it. He had built that herd cow by cow, most years adding 2 or 3 pairs when the calf check allowed for it, never borrowing more than he could see his way clear to repay. 11 years was a long time to have nothing under your name but livestock. The lease was month to month, the kind of arrangement that had felt secure for a decade because nobody had reason to end it. That changed the winter before, when the landowner died and his son came back from Springfield to settle the estate. The son asked questions about the ground that men usually ask when they intend to sell it or farm it themselves, not the kind of questions a tenant wants to hear answered. Cal did not have the money for good pasture. Good pasture in Dade County was running $600 to $800 an acre in the spring of 1987, land other farmers were fighting over even as the farm crisis emptied out farms 2 counties over. He had $22,000 in savings, most of it built the same slow way as the herd, and a limited borrowing relationship with First National in Greenfield that would extend against cattle inventory, but not against unproven ground. He could not compete for good land. He knew that going in. So he stopped looking at good land. He was not looking for cheap land. He was looking for land that was cheap for the wrong reason. 3 weeks before the auction, on a cold Saturday in February, Cal walked the property without telling anyone. He did not call the seller's agent. He did not want anyone to see him caring about a place everyone else had already dismissed. His father had worked fence and well crews in southwest Missouri for 30 years, repairing cisterns, stone walls, and spring boxes on ground other men had given up on. He had taught Cal that neglected ground keeps its history in 3 places. Cattle trails do not disappear. Cedar can mark moisture. Fitted stone means somebody built something there for a reason. Cal walked the fence line for 2 hours. In the northeast corner, where the cedar had grown thick enough to block the wind, he found a trail. It was too even to be deer. It ran in a straight line through the brush toward the thickest stand of cedar on the property, and the ground along it was packed harder than the ground on either side. He followed it in. At the base of one of the larger cedars, his boot hit something solid under 6 inches of duff. He knelt and cleared the leaf litter with his hand. Underneath was cut limestone, fitted, laid in a shallow curve. He did not dig further. If he knew too much before the sale, it would show on his face at the auction, and somebody would start asking why a man was that interested in brush. He wrote 3 lines in a notebook that night. Northeast corner, cedar thicket. Old trail runs to it. Cut stone under duff, 6 inches, fitted. 3 weeks later, he bought the farm. The following week, the story had already reached the coffee counter in town, the way any auction result did in a county that small. Harold Beam, who had farmed in the county longer than most men had been alive, and had watched enough of his neighbors go under in the last 5 years to have opinions about who deserved to make it, said what everyone at the counter was thinking out loud. Brush doesn't feed cows. Somebody near the register said the price had been cheap, $125 an acre, cheaper than anybody had seen move in that county in years. Harold said, "Cheap is not the same as a good deal." He stirred his coffee and did not look up. Cedar doesn't make a payment. A pause then, if it had water, somebody would have used it by now. Nobody at the counter disagreed with him. Nobody had a reason to. The place had sat idle since before most of them had taken over their own family ground, and a man does not walk away from a farm that works. Cal was not at the counter that morning, but word of it reached him the way word reached everyone in Dade County, secondhand and only half changed in the telling. He did not go looking for Harold to argue the point. He was not there to argue. He had a fence to fix. He spent 3 weekends in April on the perimeter, replacing wire and resetting posts where cattle had pushed through years earlier. Materials came to $2,700. When the fence was tight, he did not turn in his herd. He turned in 18 dry cows with no calves at side, as a test group. He wanted to see what the ground would tell him before he risked pairs on it. What the cattle did in the next 3 days was not grazing behavior. Day 1, 12 of the 18 stood in the northeast cedar for hours at a time. Day 2, 15. By day 3, all 18 had spent part of the day in that corner, and none of them were eating. There was no better forage there. There was no mineral tub, no shade advantage over the rest of the property, no tank. 2 of the cows pawed at the ground near the stone. 1 licked the exposed limestone directly. Cal wrote it down that evening. Cattle licking stone, pawing, not grazing, looking for something. He cleared the cedar around the stone the following weekend, cutting close and hauling brush by hand so he would not disturb whatever the roots had grown around. What came out from under the growth was not a single stone. It was a partial circular curb, the remains of an old cistern, built low into a natural swale in the ground. He tied a bolt to a length of baling twine and lowered it through a gap in the stonework. It went down 5 to 6 feet before it stopped. When he pulled it back up, the bolt was wet and it carried the faint mineral smell of cold limestone water. Not pond water, not surface runoff. Something that had been sitting undisturbed, protected, for a long time. He did not celebrate. He wrote it in the notebook and drove to the county recorder's office the following Monday. The 1931 survey plat for the property showed a small notation near the northeast corner that modern records did not carry. A stock cistern built off a spring-fed seep, marked in a surveyor's shorthand that had gone out of use decades earlier. The farm had been abandoned in stages after 1968. Nobody had grazed it seriously in almost 20 years. The cedar had come in behind the neglect and buried the system under duff and root growth until it disappeared from every record that mattered to a bank or an auctioneer. The county record had forgotten it. The cattle had not. The restoration was not romantic. It was slow, dirty work spread across 3 weekends in May and June. Cal pulled out years of leaf silt, a collapsed section of galvanized pipe, and enough debris to fill the bed of his truck twice. After the first weekend of cleaning, the cistern recovered 90 gallons overnight. After the second weekend, once he had cleared more silt and reconnected part of an old seep line running uphill, it recovered 210 gallons overnight. He found the seep line by probing above the cistern with a steel rod every few feet until he hit a section that had settled and collapsed. 28 feet of old drainage tile had failed under the weight of decades of leaf cover. He replaced it with corrugated plastic pipe. After that repair, overnight recovery reached 480 gallons. None of it looked like progress while he was doing it. Most weekends amounted to a man on his knees in cold mud, pulling out handfuls of black silt and dead leaf matter that had been settling undisturbed since before Cal was born. He found the collapsed pipe on the second weekend, a section of galvanized line that had rusted through and folded in on itself, and he had to cut it out with a hacksaw, working half-blind by feel in 6 inches of water. He fenced the cistern with a 6-foot radius of woven wire to keep cattle from fouling the source, and ran a half-inch polyline downhill by gravity to a 300-gallon stock tank in the middle of the recovering pasture. No pump, no electricity, no well casing. Total cost for the entire restoration, $840. A drilled well on that ground, by quote from a contractor out of Lockwood, would have run $9,200, with no guarantee of hitting water at all in that part of the county. July of 1987 turned dry across Dade County. Ponds dropped. A seasonal creek 2 miles east of Cal's place stopped running by the second week of the month. Cal moved 28 cow-calf pairs onto the recovering pasture once the flow from the cistern had proven steady through June. Across the road, Gene Thurman was hauling water. $55 a load, 1,200 gallons a load, 2 loads a day, into a dry pond that had served his herd for 15 years without complaint until that summer. The tank truck came out from Greenfield twice daily, and Gene stood at the fence line each time, watching it fill a pond his cattle would drink down again within hours. Cal checked his tank at first light every morning, a habit he had kept since the restoration first started holding water in June. He did not need to check it. The float valve on the stock tank would have told him if anything failed. He checked it anyway, the way a man checks something he has worked hard for and does not yet fully trust. On July 14th, after 28 pairs had been through it overnight in the kind of heat that had every pond in the township dropping by the day, the tank read 190 gallons at 6 a.m. By 8 a.m. it was at 260 gallons and climbing the gravity line from the cistern, feeding it steadily from a source nobody but Cal knew still existed. He did not mention it to anyone. He went back to checking fence. By October, the numbers were in. 26 of the 28 pairs had produced live calves that fall, averaging 498 pounds at weaning. The weighted sale average came to 81 cents a pound. The calf check totaled $10,478. It did not make Cal rich. It did not pay off the land in a single season. What it did was cover the interest on his operating note and the November payment without touching his savings. That fall, Cal called Bill Ashworth at First National and asked him to send an appraiser back out. In March, the appraiser had valued the farm at $125 an acre, brush ground with no certified water. In December, walking the same property, the appraiser noted the fenced cistern, the repaired seep line, the flow records Cal had kept on notebook paper since May, and 40 acres of pasture recovering under a documented gravity-fed water system. He appraised the farm at $290 an acre. On 120 acres, that came to $34,800 in appraised value. Bill Ashworth told Cal the improved collateral position qualified him for a credit line up to $20,000 if he wanted it. Cal did not draw the line. He used the new appraisal to renegotiate his existing operating note, and the improved terms saved him $1,840 in interest over the remaining term. In January, at a Farm Bureau meeting in Greenfield, Gene Thurman found Cal near the coffee urn and asked him something that had apparently been on his mind since July. "Did that well show on any county record?" Cal said, "1931 survey plat, nothing since." Gene said, "Then how did you know to look?" Cal said, "I followed the cattle trail, then the cattle confirmed it." Gene said, "The cattle told you?" Cal said, "They were doing what cattle had always done on that ground. They were going where the water was. They just had 40 years of cedar over it." Gene was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup on the table without drinking from it. Then he said he had a cedar thicket on the west end of his own farm, where his cows tended to bunch up in the afternoons, and he had always figured it was for the shade. He had been farming that ground since 1961 and had never once thought to ask the cattle a question. Cal said it might be shade. It might be worth probing. Gene probed it the following weekend with a length of rebar he kept in the truck bed, working the same patient way he had watched Cal work all summer, and hit moisture at 16 inches. He cleared a small swale that spring, found nothing as old or as built as Cal's cistern, but found enough. It saved him 2 weeks of water hauling the next summer, and $55 a load was $55 a load, whether a man was proud of where the water came from or not. By December, the county no longer listed the brush place the way it had in March. In March, it had been 120 acres of cedar with no certified water, $125 an acre. By December, it was 120 acres with a documented stock water source, 40 acres of recovering pasture, and a calf crop that had made the year's note payment, $290 an acre. Cal had not changed the farm with a new drilled well. He had changed it with a probe rod, a length of baling twine, a bolt, 3 weekends of cleaning, and 28 feet of drainage tile. But mostly, he had changed it because he was willing to follow an old cattle trail into a cedar thicket when everyone else was still reading the auction listing. The county saw brush, the bank saw no collateral, the auction room saw a mistake. The cattle had been walking to that corner since before the farm was abandoned. They already knew what was there. Cal just followed them. If you're finding these useful, there's a subscribe button below. One decision at a time, with the real numbers. The county called it brush for 19 years. The cattle called it something else.